Welcome back. So this is the first video of Chapter 18. So Chapter 18, we're continuing with our open economy. And in this chapter, we're going to focus on the goods market. And so we know from way back that our goods market is our IS curve. And in a closed economy, we said, okay, well, we're going to focus on domestic demand, and our equilibrium condition is that it has to be equal to domestic production. So demand was C plus I plus G. What did consumers buy? What was investment? What did the government buy? And in equilibrium, that has to be equal to how much we produce. Now, obviously, in an open economy, we have imports and we have exports. And so we have to adjust our equation for our IS curve in terms of imports and exports. And we'll see, we have to take into account the real exchange rate because we're talking about goods. And we have to think about, all right, well, some of that C and I and G are going to be spent on imports. So we have to subtract that out because we didn't produce it. And we're going to set it equal to domestic production. And then, of course, exports, we don't consume, we don't buy, somebody else buys. And so we have to add that in order to get that same equilibrium condition. So we really want to think about how the U.S. and really any open economy is positioned within the world. The U.S. recession, as we talked about in Chapter 17 in 2009, led to a world recession. And so we want to think about, well, what's the relationship between U.S. GDP and imports and GDP in other countries and exports? Because obviously, if those affect demand in the United States and around the world, that's going to have sort of a repercussion effect when something goes wrong in one country. So we're going to start off by sort of noting the difference between the demand for domestic goods and the domestic demand for goods. That might seem a little confusing at first. So the demand for domestic goods is, well, what's the demand for everything that we produce in the United States, right? Or whatever country we're interested in. So we start off with our C plus I plus G still, right? So consumer spending, investment spending, and government spending. But in an open economy, some of that demand is not for domestic goods, it's for foreign goods. So we have to subtract out those imports. And in order to do it, in order to put it into American goods, we have to divide by the real exchange rate, right? Remember, the real exchange rate is U.S. goods in terms of foreign goods. And so imports are foreign goods. We divide by the exchange rate. That puts it into U.S. goods. And we subtract that out because those imports are included in C and I and G. So they are not demand for domestic goods. But then we also have to add in exports. Now, exports are in American goods, right? We make them in America. We sell them elsewhere. They're not part of C and I and G, right? So they're going someplace else. So we have to add in exports. Okay. Now, C and I and G are total domestic demand for goods. That's sort of where we started before. And we can keep our same equations for C and I and G. We can say, okay, C is going to depend on disposable income still. I is going to depend on GDP and the real interest rate. And G we continue to assume is exogenous because it's decided by the political process. So, all right, well, we want to think about this. We want to think, okay, well, what's the relationship between our variables of interest and imports and exports? Now, we're going to assume that imports increase when we have more income. That makes sense, right? When we have more income, we're going to buy more imports. We're probably also going to buy more domestic goods, but we'll buy more of everything. The real exchange rate is going to be important, right? We said an appreciation of the exchange rate makes imports cheaper. So when the real exchange rate goes up, we're going to buy more imports. When the real exchange rate goes down, we're going to buy fewer imports. So we're going to say our imports depend on our GDP, our income. If we have more income, we're going to buy more imports, and the real exchange rate. When the real exchange rate is higher, we're going to buy more imports. When it's lower, we're going to buy fewer imports. Now, exports are not going to depend on our own GDP. They're going to depend on the other country's GDP. Now, we're just going to assume there's sort of one other country or sort of the rest of the world. So that's Y star, right? Remember that any variable that has a star or asterisk on it is the foreign version of that variable. So exports depend on foreign GDP or foreign income, and they depend negatively on the exchange rate. So a higher real exchange rate is going to lead to lower exports because those exports are going to be more expensive compared to the goods that are produced in the foreign economy. And a real depreciation is going to lead to higher exports because now our exports are going to be relatively cheaper compared to the goods made in the foreign economy. So the exchange rate is important for both. Domestic GDP is important for imports, and foreign GDP is important for exports. Now, let's try to graph all of this. This graph is a little bit confusing, but let's go through it. So here is our domestic demand. This is what we started with, way back in chapter 3 or 4, whenever that was. And so we have output here, we've got demand here, and this is just our domestic demand, C plus I plus G. Now, because we have an open economy, some of that C and I and G is imports. And so we want to take those out because we didn't produce them, right? That's not our output. So we subtract out imports, adjusting for the real exchange rate. Notice that the wedge gets increasing, sort of increases in size. And so the idea there is that we import more relatively to demand as our income goes up, which is maybe a reasonable assumption. But we also have to add back in exports. So we go from, all right, here's domestic demand. We subtract out imports, but then we add in exports to get to our ZZ line. So, and that just shifts up by the same amount because it doesn't depend on our output, right? It only depends on foreign output, foreign income. And so our equilibrium then is here, and we can see, so when we have sort of the same domestic demand and demand for domestic goods, where this crosses, that's our trade surplus. We don't have to be there. We could be there, right? But we don't have to be. If we are over here, then demand for domestic goods is higher than domestic demand, and so we have a trade surplus. And if we're over here, then domestic demand is higher than demand for domestic goods, and so we have a trade deficit. So to the right of this trade balance, we have a trade deficit. To the left of this trade balance, we have a trade surplus. So this is really just going through that line, right? So we start with the domestic demand for domestic goods at AA, and the line DD represents domestic demand. So actually we started with DD, we got to AA, then we added in exports to get to ZZ, and that distance is constant just because it depends on foreign income, not domestic income, and domestic income is what is on the horizontal axis. So we're going to use this graph, right, especially this double graph here, to think about what happens when we get a shift in demand, either domestic demand, foreign demand, change in the real exchange rate, and then we can kind of see what's going to happen both to sort of output and to the trade surplus.